Hi everybody, welcome to Module 3 of this course. The theme that I want you to focus on in this module is still education, but instead of Victor's education, Volume 2 of Frankenstein focuses on the creature and how he learns about human society. When you read Volume 2, pay special attention to how the creature learns. Think back to Elizabeth and Victor's upbringing and contrast it to the creatures, or compare it to the creatures. Think about what Victor told us in Volume 1 about Elizabeth's interests specifically, namely nature and literature. Are there any similarities between her and the creature? When writing Frankenstein, Shelley was very much aware of her mother's treatise on women's rights and education. Mary Wollstonecraft's The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, originally written as a response to two works, Thomas Paine's revolutionary era text, The Rights of Man, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile, a treatise on educating young boys. As you'll see in the excerpts that I'm asking you to read, Wollstonecraft's main interest in securing women's equality with men is women's education, and she criticizes the fact that women were brought up to be far more concerned with how they look and dress than with how they think. She believes that women's focus on appearance is only to attract men who will then make the decisions for them. But if women were educated, they could hold an equal place with men in society. Women are told from their infancy and taught by the example of their mothers that a little knowledge of human weakness, justly termed cunning, softness of temper, outward obedience, and a scrupulous attention to a puerile kind of propriety will obtain for them the protection of man. And should they be beautiful, everything else is needless for at least 20 years of their lives. This was an extremely radical statement at the time, and kind of still is today to an extent, as we're still very much image conscious and we still focus, even on little girls, on their appearance. But it's also interesting to note Wollstonecraft's use of the word puerile. Puerile means childish. We've seen this word before in Frankenstein. If you remember in Volume 2, what context is it used in? This could hold a key to the connections between Frankenstein the novel and Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Another connection between the two, as Joyce Zanana points out in the scholarly article I gave you to read for this week, is a seemingly minor character. But she holds another key to the connection between Frankenstein and Vindication. This is the story of the, quote, Arabian Safie, Felix de Lacy's wife and one of the cottagers. Her letters, which the creature copies and offers to Frankenstein the copies as proof of the truth of his story, are found at the literal center of Frankenstein. Often when we're reading books, in novels, it's really, or poetry, or even plays, it's important to look at what's at the very center, what comes halfway through the novel. This is often a way that a writer will indicate what's especially important to them. According to Zanana, this is not only to highlight the fact that the novel is a framed tale told in what she calls concentric narratives on page 170, but to prove that Shelley wrote her novel as a consciously feminist one and concerned especially with women's education. After all, it is Safie's learning French, the language of the cottagers, that also leads to the creatures learning that language and to his learning of morality and human relationships and human behaviors. Safie's letters explain how she dreamed of escaping the literal and metaphorical enslavement of the Turkish society in which she was raised. Her mother, a Christian Arab, was captured as a slave and forced to marry Safie's father, a Muslim. Wollstonecraft and Shelley's negative view of Islam can certainly be read as problematic and even racist. There's no denying that. But Zanana argues that, like other Enlightenment writers, namely Montesquieu in his Persian letters, Mahometanism, i.e. Islam, is used as a figure, that is a metaphor, for an error that the writers find central to Western culture, the refusal to grant women full membership as rational beings in the human race. Regarding Shelley's portrayal of Safie, Zanana writes, quote, the figure of the rebellious Oriental woman must be read as it was intended by the author, as a powerful commentary on the patriarchal construction of woman as flesh in Europe. The idea of woman as flesh is highlighted by the fact that one of the books that the creature finds in Volume 2 and that has a huge effect on his education is Paradise Lost. Written in 1667 by John Milton, Paradise Lost is an epic poem that retells the story of Adam and Eve from a Christian point of view, and moreover, a lot of people have argued from the point of view of Satan, the fallen angel Lucifer. We can see some slides here in the slide, some images. The Temptation of the Fall of Eve on the left side by William Blake, who illustrated Paradise Lost in 1808, shows Adam kind of fascinated by the apples or the fruit, and Eve intertwined with the serpent and sharing the apple. This is a very unusual depiction of Eve's temptation and how close she is with the serpent. On the right side of the screen, we have a detail from Cranach the Elder's painting of Adam and Eve, and it's a much bigger painting. It shows whole bodies and the tree of knowledge and all of that. It's a really incredible painting. But you can kind of see the different looks on the characters' faces. Eve looks really like knowledgeable. She looks like she knows what she's doing, and Adam looks just kind of bewildered there. The inclusion of Paradise Lost, of course, allows the creature to read the story of Adam and Eve from Satan's point of view and to identify himself and to compare himself with the fallen angel. But the story serves another purpose. The reference to Paradise Lost allows Shelley to critique the epic poem's patriarchal framework and really negative depiction of Eve. It represents all of the old arguments about women's original sin and allows for Shelley to show her more feminist point of view about women's education. So besides French, what else does the creature learn from the de Lacys? According to Zanana, by copying her letters, the creature can use Safi's story as, quote, evidence of his story about his own moral development. For he too tells a tale about a body's discovery of itself as spirit, and of that spirit's need for a congenial social world in which to function. That's a quote from Zanana, page 174. In other words, the creature identifies with Safi and her desire to self-actualize, part of which is to choose her own husband. This is very interesting, but also very problematic in many ways. The creature, who identifies as male and is identified as a male, is using Safi, a woman's arguments, about choosing her own husband, and Safi, who comes from a tradition of women's oppression, both Western and non-Western, and the centralization of her story as one that's a feminist one, and at the same time, Safi does not get to tell her own story. Remember that it's the creature who ends up telling her story, and the creature who then takes her story and appropriates it for his own purposes. The creature uses the copies of Safi's letters to argue more convincingly to Victor that the scientist should create a wife for him. I chose this still from the film Bride of Frankenstein deliberately if you look at the looks on the characters' faces, right? The creature, the male creature, right, is looking at the female creature extremely lovingly. He has chosen to love. He has chosen to want a wife. She has had no say in it, on the other hand, and this will be highlighted more actually in Volume 3 and also in Nick Deer's play, which we'll be reading in 2 weeks. Think about the way that gender is used in the novel. I don't think that there's one easy answer to it. I think it's actually very complex layers. But thinking about women's education this week, what can we learn from Safi's story, and what would be the difference if Safi had had the opportunity to tell her own story? What if the female creature had ever been given a voice? Well, I'm jumping ahead a little bit to Volume 3. But you will find out. Keep thinking about these issues in terms of gender. Who gets to speak for themselves in this novel, and how is that significant? So in what ways do women's voices become subservient to men's in the novel Frankenstein? This is a complicated and layered question, of course. But it is clear that by relegating the women in the novel to the margins, Margaret Saville, Elizabeth Lavenza, Safi and Agatha de Lacy, and Justine Morris, and having their stories be narrated by men, that Shelley is questioning how much women have been able to make any headway into society, even in spite of her mother's treatise on the vindication of the rights of women. The books that the creature reads, by contrast, Volney's Ruins of Empire, Milton's Paradise Lost, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, and Plutarch's Lives, are all also written by men, and they frame the stories. Some of them are love stories, some of them are stories about power, but they all revolve around men's actions and men's opinions about those subjects. On the other hand, Shelley herself was influenced by female writers, including by her mother, and also by the tradition of Gothic novels, which I've mentioned before. These are supernatural and mystery stories and the really popular fiction of Mary Shelley's time, and they were predominantly written by women. According to Christine Bertin, the Gothic novel, The Airport Book of the Age, was perfectly in line with the feminine experience. The story is a metaphor of the pathway to becoming a woman, of moving out of the father's house and into that of the husband, with all of the attendant terror that might result. The typical Gothic plot typically revolves around a pure, virginal, and ethereal young woman at the mercy of villains bent on robbing her of her life, her virtue, her wealth, and so on. The novel is usually set in a convent, a crypt, or a haunted castle, which is a veiled representation of the house. The heroine wanders from room to room in a bid to escape the villains and simply survive. This is the premise of all horror movies as well. By the end, all of the terrors have subsided, and after the darkness, rays of light finally flood in. The young woman is able to enter society and marry the husband she so deeply needs. This was the main literary style in which a woman could write openly. Shelley's Frankenstein is a different kind of novel. It's certainly influenced by the Gothic tradition, and the supernatural elements of the story are certainly there. But at the same time, it's a completely different kind of story. It's science fiction, and it takes contemporary ideas of natural philosophy and what the creation of life could possibly be like, and it also centralizes, unlike Gothic fiction, the voices of three men: Robert Walton, Victor Frankenstein, and the creature. And so it's a very different kind of story, even though it was influenced by this women's literature of the day. If you read volume 2 and you're starting to write your paper about women's education and the creature's education in the novel, think about these gendered differences. Think about how the creature has to learn in some ways like a woman, but the ways in which he takes what he learns much more like a man, and what Shelley might have been trying to convey with that idea. Thank you for listening to this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it sparks some more interest in this difficult but hopefully ultimately rewarding second volume of the novel. Keep reading, keep working, and I will see you in the discussion boards.